Dr. Vela? Hi, Dr. Helmus.
Why can't I view?
Can I test to see if I can share my screen?
Absolutely. Let me enable these security settings. Sorry, my Zoom is acting a little weird today. Let's see, start video.
Host, my screen sharing is disabled, so I can't share my.
You should be able to now.
Cannot start screen share while other participant is sharing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Of course. Sorry.
So take that down and I'll plop up mine. All right.
There we go.
Okay, what am I doing here? So let's try that one. All right, so, well, let's go. Hang on. All right, how's that?
Perfect. Looks good.
So how long, quick before I guess I'm eating my burger, before this thing goes live, what do we have, an hour?
Yeah, we have an hour. So I want to say about, we'll start about 5 minutes after. So that will give you about, I want to say about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. Sometimes we run a little bit over. And, it's sort of a mixed crowd. So I think, there will be some questions, but we also have a mix of students and faculty. So it sort of bounces around on how much engagement we get towards the end. So, I would expect, certainly myself and Ravi usually end up with 3 or 4 questions, and, a few people will message us some questions as well. And so you're welcome to, answer them in long form or short form, up to you.
Okay. I'm going to send you a link to my report so you can include that.
Oh, yeah. Let's do that.
Shall I send it to you or just include it in the chat?
You can put it in the chat or email. Either one will work.
All right. If you can start, I'm on here. Where is this thing? Chat. I'm not seeing the chat. Oh, there we go. Chat. Okay. So if I got like 2 minutes, I'm going to run and refresh my coffee.
Sounds good. Perfect. Yeah, you got probably about 5 minutes. So we'll start,
Oh, well, then I'll get 2 cups of coffee.
Yeah. We'll start 3 minutes or 5 minutes after. So
all right, I'll be back in just a hot second.
All right. Alrighty. Let's start admitting people. Oops, cancel.
Your screen is up now, right?
Yes, that's correct. Okay, let's see. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to our UCF-NCITE seminar series on understanding extremism and radicalization. This seminar series is put on in part through the support of the DHS National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center. As the caveat that we state every time, anything stated here does not represent the policies, beliefs, or conclusions of DHS or the United States government. Now, today we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Todd Helmus from RAND. He's going to be speaking to us about countering violent extremism in the military. Dr. Helmus is a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation and a member of the Pardee RAND Graduate School faculty. He specializes in strategic communications, disinformation, and terrorism. His latest research focuses on ways to counter Russian disinformation campaigns in the United States and Europe, and assesses the impact of international counter-violent extremism campaigns. His research also focuses on examining the networks of ISIS supporters and opponents on Twitter, identifying ways to enlist key influencers in support of U.S. strategic communications, and developing approaches to assess the impact of propaganda campaigns. He has served as a deployed advisor to the U.S. commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan and led studies on U.S. efforts to train Afghan Special Operations Forces. And he's also received his PhD in clinical psychology from Wayne State University. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Helmus in order to begin his presentation. What we'll probably do is, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand at the end of the seminar or type your question to me, and we'll have them, we'll unmute you, and we can have them interact and have a dialogue with you. So with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Helmus.
All right, let me do a screen share. Thanks for that introduction. All right, let's do this briefing here. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk with everybody. Like I said, my name's Todd Helmus. I'm a researcher here at RAND. I do a mix of disinformation and extremism work. Been really working extremism issues since probably 2005 or something like that, when I started working that on the Al-Qaeda problem set. So anyway, let's just get started. So today's talk, here's what I want to talk to you about. So my title is, we're talking about counter-violent extremism in the military. We'll start with why, then talk about some of the project scope and methods, and then findings and conclusions. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand during this. I'm happy to take questions as we go, but otherwise I'll try and make this brief, about 20 minutes, and give us time for Q&A. So, obviously there's concern about extremism in the military. It's been a long-standing issue. I think we know Ku Klux Klan pretty much started by some Confederate generals long ago in 1865, and the military has, struggled with everything else in society, with segregation in U.S. history. And as I'll go through in a minute, there's certainly been incidences of extremism in the military, but obviously we're concerned now because the finding that there were military folks involved in the crowd that rioted at the U.S. Capitol and broke inside and caused a lot of havoc. So there are a lot of concerns based on the fact that there were these anecdotal evidence of some current, definitely former military people involved in that crowd, some relatively high ranking, one a lieutenant colonel, former special operations guy, was one of the individuals, I think, at the podium at the Senate dais. So, and I think recent data suggests that, I think the last I heard was maybe about 15% or so of the of those involved in the riot, at least those who have been arrested and charged, have some military background. So the military is obviously very concerned about this. they've initiated a number of steps to try to address this, including developing a commission led by a gentleman named Garrison Bishop to assess what the military needs to do, and they've already started to implement some steps in this regard. There's this is not new. If we just go starting in recent modern history from 1968, you have a lot of incidences of white supremacy and right-wing extremism on military campuses, starting with this, celebratory parade honoring the murder of Martin Luther King. KKK chapter starts in 1976 at Camp Pendleton. In 1986, there's concerns growing about diversion of weapons to extremist groups, particularly Aryan Nation, White Patriot Party, and others. And that event causes the Secretary of Defense to publish, I think, the first directive against white supremacy in the military. A few years later, we had the Oklahoma City bombing, led by a couple veterans, as well as this neo-Nazi group formed at the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg. And some of those members, in fact, murdered an African-American couple on the installation or near the installation. And that caused a number of policy reviews as well. So I won't go through all of these issues, but there's been a lot of examples of these things throughout history. And it's not just right-wing extremism. I think it was Nadal Hassan. I think I'm getting that name right, but he was a physician, I think an army psychiatrist who ended up conducting a major terrorist attack on a military installation at Fort Hood, killing and wounding a decent number of people there. So it's not a new issue. Despite this, I think what's interesting is, despite it not being a new issue, we know very little about this problem set, about this concern. If what we do know, we know a little bit. We know that these groups target right wing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about right wing extremism. That's going to be the focus of this talk, because that is the major concern right now, security wise. Though some of these recommendations that I'll talk about certainly apply to other forms of extremism. But for various reasons, that is a key security focus of concern. But anyway, the extremist groups actively seek out and target military personnel. We did an interview, in fact, published an op-ed earlier this spring with the former leader of the social nationalist movement. I'm forgetting, but it's a major neo-Nazi group. What this guy basically says, and I'll try and include the chat, this link in the chat, but that they really wanted to target military people. Military people were disciplined. They're good leaders. They would just basically make good members of any local organization, whether or not that organization is right wing or white supremacist or what have you. But the special benefit to these groups is military people know how to use weapons. And when you think there's going to be a race war coming up, you want the guys who know how to use weapons. And so they really make an effort to recruit those people, and have shaped to some degree how they orient themselves to including upping their sort of patriotism component, increasing use of American flags and things like that to recruit those folks. When we look at prior samples of extremists, military people pop up in those, can make up about 30% of those samples. And we also know that from very recent surveys, that 30% of those in the military have reported seeing racist ideology in the military, and that number pops up to 50% if you're a person of color. So 50% of those in color have really seen a bit of this racist ideology in the military. Probably not a big surprise. But that's not very much. I mean, we know a little bit. We know there's an issue, but there's several things we don't know. We don't know why military people are at risk for doing these types of things. If we don't honestly know if they are at risk, but there's no prevalence data suggesting what percent of the military people support violent causes, or white supremacy or hate groups or things like that. It honestly wouldn't be hard to figure that out. There's all sorts of survey data right now suggesting a decent component of the population is willing to entertain the notion of violence to assert their political views. I think the latest figure is maybe around 25%, 20 to 25% of the population, 30% if you're Republican, 11% if you're a Democrat, 15% if you're an independent, view some sort of notion that violence may be necessary to protect the country from opposing political parties. But we don't know what the percentage is in the military. We don't know what it looks like at the unit level. Is it tolerated at the unit level? Is it not tolerated? If you are a white supremacist in an infantry unit, do you have to hide that or not? And that's an interesting question. And the final piece here is what interventions are available? If there is a problem, and we think there is some kind of problem, but if there is a problem, then what do you do about it? And that's really the focus on today's talk for me. All right, so I've sort of reviewed some of the historical stuff. Now we'll talk about reviewing counter-extremism policies as they're practiced in the United States and how you might apply those to the Department of Defense. CV initiatives. So this is a graph from my colleague, friend and colleague, Brian Jackson, who did a very popular report, very important report back in 2019 on the domestic CVE space. This is just a general sort of classic mobilization phase that one might get for radicalizing to an extremist cause, whether or not that be ISIS or KKK. You know, you have this broad cohort of the population that is vulnerable, and you know, programs at this phase seek to prevent people from becoming adopting extreme views. You move over to the right, you have people starting to, in this early phase, you have people still adopting sort of hateful views, extremist ideology. There's sort of radicalization and going on this trajectory, though they might not be advocating for violence just yet, or you know, be a specific member of an extremist group. And then the middle phase is people are really radicalizing toward violence, and then eventually mobilizing toward violence, and then I think you might not be able to see it from the Google, or not from the Zoom platform, but on the right you have this sort of kaboom that happens when people actually mobilize. So what we wanted to do was we took this strategy, this sort of approach to thinking about CVE programming, and looked at what are interventions that have been done in the domestic space. How might these be applied at the Department of Defense? You know, we had tried to ask questions of what is it, how effective is it, and how could it be applied in the DoD landscape? And a couple assumptions here on this. One, I don't think there's much I'm saying in this brief that the Department of Defense probably does not already know. They've had a long-standing policy review process that's gone on for like 6 months. They've already submitted their report to the Secretary of Defense, and that report is, I think, going through the policy review wickets in the DoD. And I think they probably did a good job thinking what their options and recourses were. So that's the first part. The second part is, the assumption here is that this is not like a major problem, that it's a problem. And in fact, any individual who radicalizes toward violence is a major problem. But prevalence-wise, it's probably not so huge. And that assumption is sort of reflected in our general approach to this, as I'll talk about. I'll pause there. Are there any questions at this point?
I had a quick question. Could you restate that statistic about the acceptance of violence? I think you said it was something on the order of 25%. Could you provide a little bit more clarity on that, or?
Yes. Let me.
I was kind of surprised at how high that number was.
Right. Let's see. What is it called? Survey. I forget I'd have to look it up. I will look it up and make sure I share that before the end of the brief. It was a survey that was recently done this last month. And I think the question boils down to, I forget what the survey question was, but it basically asks like, would you be willing to, I'll have to look it up.
Okay, no problem. I was just surprised at how high that number was, right?
Yes, I think, but the key is it's sort of important, I guess, to do that in the context of what the specific question was. Mm-hmm. American support, This is from February 2011. A survey done by Pew, I think. There's a more recent one that basically asks whether or not political violence may be necessary. And I'll have to, okay, survey found that 3 in 10 Americans, including 39% of Republicans, agreed that if elected leaders will not protect America, the people must do it themselves, even if it requires violent actions. Wow. So that's the type of survey question that you're starting to pick up on. It's an interesting, from a method standpoint, it's an interesting question because people obviously aren't afraid to attest to having those views, which I think would make it a sort of a good starter for assessing extremist tendencies in the military. That's on top of being able to look at whether or not people are engaged in hate groups. And those are probably 2 separate, interrelated, but probably separate issues of sort of political radicalization, and white supremacy and hate groups. All right. Any other questions? All right. All right. So let's look at this early phase really quick. And there are 3 key sort of approaches that have been done at this early phase to address extremism in the regular U.S. communities. One is messaging campaigns. These use social media, videos, personal engagement, and a lot of it's focused on dissuading people from joining extremist groups. RAND, for example, did an assessment of a CVE, counter-violent extremism campaign on social media in Indonesia. We did an assessment of a radio program in Nigeria. Those types of interventions are relatively commonplace, and a lot of governments are funding those types of things. Other interventions, messaging campaigns are more focused on education and inculcating important skills like media literacy, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Community awareness briefs has been a popular tool within the domestic CVE landscape. I think most of these last 15 years, the primary concern has been Islamic terrorism. Whether or not the data support that primary concern, I think, is a question. But it's been almost the exclusive focus of the national security sector is on Islamic extremism. And here, their big approach was community awareness briefings, going into local communities, talking to parents, talking to community leaders, trying to do a couple things. One, build a relationship. So CV practitioners at the federal government level need to build relationships with local level people. So local level people have some trust in who they are. And if they need to, drop a dime on someone in the community who is radicalizing, they feel comfortable doing that. But they also need to know what to look for, what are the signs and symptoms, how do I know if my kid's radicalizing, and if they are, what do I do about it? Those are that's really the focus of these community awareness briefings. And then the second part is resilience risk factor issues. There's this notion that within some forms of extremism, you get high levels of mental health problems. Can you support efforts that promote treatment for those types of mental health efforts? And, there's not a lot of evidence to supporting that just yet, but that's a new focus that's a new focus in the CV space, is that sort of primary prevention focused on the mental health space. All right, so let's talk a few of these and how we talk about these applying the DoD side. The first are warnings. There is a fair, what is a warning? A warning is basically highlighting individuals that they may encounter several things, I think, depending on what the study is looking at: false, misleading, persuasive content, that they'll be targeted by extremist groups, or that they're going to be targeted by foreign propaganda efforts, or that they will be receiving, or that disinformation specialists are looking to send information to them. Those types of messages have been routinely used in a lot of different types of studies. And then you can also add onto that in what's called an inoculation intervention. In other words, you don't just warn them that someone's going to be trying to influence you, or this group is going to try to recruit you on a particular topic, but you also give them an opportunity to practice responding to that. So the notion is you give people a weakened form of the negative stimuli that they might face. And so it could be some sort of weakened form of a recruitment pitch to join a white supremacy group or whatever. And then you have them practice, like, how would you respond to that? And that type of practice has been shown in a number of different studies to be effective. These studies have looked at disinformation, climate change, extremist propaganda. So there's a lot of evidence that this works. I think we're just starting to move this into the implementation phase and a lot of different efforts. I think obviously on the DoD side, this could be implemented at the induction phase. And in fact, it is on some level. One of the few policy things that they've already implemented for the DoD is to start warning people at the point of induction that they are going to be a special target for anti-government and hateful extremist groups. Media literacy programs, that's all the rage now. The main concern with media, for the main focus of most media literacy campaigns is to guard against disinformation. To help people think carefully about the sources of information that they're seeing on their Facebook feeds, assessing the credibility of that, thinking critically about how they present and share that information. You know, you get certain memes like think twice before sharing information on social media, think about what the motive is, why is this person sending you this content, think about the nature of the content, are they actually telling you anything or are they just blowing steam? So, you know, the question is, can you use these things to address radicalization toward violence? I think that's an open question at this point. We know that media literacy works in general. It has had mixed reviews in the few research studies that have been done on impacting racist or extremist attitudes. So it's not clear how effective that is. It is something the DoD has to do. It's been inducted. It's a part of legislation has like basically mandated, the NDAA has mandated that the DoD start implementing media literacy education efforts within the force. And our basic argument is that, yes, do that. And you can probably start addressing some of these extremist type themes into that media literacy training. A lot of you are probably familiar with this on some level, or maybe not, but there's a growing use of, well, it's really the most famous piece is the redirect method. And basically a group called Moonshot does this. They basically buy ad time on Google. And when anybody types in, how do I join the KKK? How do I join ISIS? How do I join Proud Boys? Moonshot can sort of program for those types of Google queries. And then like any advertisement you see on any search result you get on Google, Moonshot's results will appear at the top of the feed as part of an ad. And then people might click on the ad because the content of the ad might look alluring. And then traditionally for the redirect method, it shows them content. For example, those looking to join ISIS, that might show a video that highlights how the real ISIS is not the same as how ISIS portrays itself. And they'll do similar sort of themes and efforts for like white right-wing or white nationalist extremist groups as well. We've done some work on this to look at the effectiveness of this. The evidence is relatively limited on the effectiveness. We know that people like the video. I don't say they like the videos. We know that when Moonshot runs these programs, people will click on the links at rates comparable to conventional ads. They'll watch the video content at rates comparable to conventional ads. So they're able to get good exposure and reach to their content. We have no clue what effect that content has on the people. I mean, there's been virtually no studies that have looked at that. So we don't know how effective that is. And my pitch regarding, I feel like the DoD, without knowing any data about the relative effectiveness of it is, my sense is they don't need to go down this counter ideological space. I feel like it's sort of a difficult space for the Department of Defense to try to change hearts and minds of service members in this way through media content. I think if they're going to do it, this is as good a way to do it as any, because the content only reaches those, very specifically just targets those who are obviously at risk for this. And you could run this program within areas that are just to have military installations. could be on the installation, could be in the town surrounding it. So it'd be very easy to target folks in the DoD who are searching for this type of content. I do think, though, what's really interesting, what Moonshot has done, though, is they've shown data that shows that people who click on right-wing extremist propaganda content are disproportionately more likely to also click on ads for crisis hotlines, which fits within what we know about the broad data, and that is people who join right-wing extremist groups, neo-Nazi groups, white supremacy groups, and have you, is they have disproportionate mental health problems, and we've shown this in a recent study that we did. So yeah, so I think, being able to provide like direct targeted mental health care to these people could be an interesting track. And by the way, you could also use this approach to measure extremism. So just looking at the installations in the cities around military installations in this country, it'd be very easy to track how many people are making these searches, searching to join ISIS, searching to join neo-Nazi groups. That is relatively trivial task for a group like Moonshot or some other tech company to do. All right, so and then education and awareness campaigns. To me, this is the most basic thing. And I think this is really the most basic thing that needs to happen, is they need to educate the force in the same way that this has been done in the civilian sector. Helping units, helping commanders know what signs to look for, what are the indications of this kind of content, what are the websites that people are scrolling on that would suggest that they're being inducted to this type of content, what are the options for engagement, and of course, what are the policies, what is the expectation for the Department of Defense on commanders for when they see this, and who do they need to call? All those things are just going to be part of just a basic awareness and education campaign that the DoD needs to do. Community resilience exercises. This is the CREX is something that's been done in the civilian space. It's basically a tabletop half-day exercise, presents scenarios about individuals who show signs of radicalization, and they basically bring the cops together, they bring the police together, they bring the clergy, mental health specialists, and they all sort of come together, and parents, and talk about what are they going to do about this case. Oh no, we're seeing this happen. What are our options? What do we do? What are the next steps? And it's basically a very basic tabletop exercise that helps people think about solutions to a very crisis situation. And we basically contend that type of scenario would be useful. Probably not everywhere, not all the time, but there are probably going to be installations that pop up where these issues arise more often than not. Not for any reason of their own, but just because these issues pop up, like they happened with the 82nd Airborne back in 1995. In that case, you'd want to really blanket the folks in the 82nd Airborne with this type of exercise, and as well as those on that installation. So, all right, a few more to go here. Middle phase. So first is, we'll just go right through these. One is referral promotion. It's really going to be important that the people who see this type of behavior within their units, within subordinates or within commanders or whoever, that they know who to call and that they feel comfortable calling. So those are two basic pieces of information you need to address. And the comfortable part, I think, is important. One thing we've learned in the civilian space is that people can get very worried. There's been a lot of concern with these Muslim communities that a regret, basically, when they've dined people out to the police because of the investigative tactics used, on someone's child or brother or what have you, and this made people reluctant to share information with the police. And those are just basic perception issues that you need to understand and to address. Off-ramping interventions. People who join these groups get tired of joining these groups. We recently did a study, Violent Extremism in America, that released, that analyzed 32 trajectories of 32 extremists, white national and Islamic, as they joined and as they left the groups. A lot of people do leave these groups. People get tired of it. And there are a lot of cases where people want to leave the group, but they're struggle to leave it because their social networks are tied up in the group, their job is tied up in the group, their whole lives are sort of entwined. And so it's hard to disaggregate from these things. And so what we basically contend is that the DoD needs to give those who it detects, they need to give them an option of getting out. Now, that doesn't mean they can't face consequences for violating DoD rules and procedures. So maybe they have to get kicked out of the military, but they should be offered some sort of treatment program to help them off ramp from those organizations. That could include mental health counseling. It could also include support from what are called farmers, people who used to be extremists and now they help others leave extremist groups. The second piece we argue is the need to help family members cope with members in their family who are engaging in extremist activities. Spouses, kids, all those folks can really struggle when someone in their family goes down this rabbit hole. And there are organizations like Parents for Peace that offer crisis hotlines that parents can call or spouses can call to gain support and to learn what they can do. And I think that type of support is necessary as well. And then the final piece I'll mention is just police training. Military police training, if they're going to be investigating these issues more going forward, then they'll probably need more support and education on how to conduct those investigations. So, and right now we don't have any recommendations on the late phase. Most of the late phase interventions really focus on programs conducted in prisons to help de-radicalize people, and we didn't think that necessary to go there just yet. So what is this slide? Our work focused on so one thing I'll just note is that there just needs to be more research on this issue. We sort of highlighted some notions. There's certainly going to be a lot of specific details one could add on to that. There's a lot of other specific initiatives that could be very helpful. But to do that, you need a lot more research. And I highlighted these questions earlier. What is the prevalence rate? What does it look like at the unit level? How does it manifest within DoD channels? Things like that are going to be important to address. And so with that, I'll just pause and do questions now.
Great, thank you, Dr. Helmus. We do have a number of questions that are starting to pop up. Let's see, but I'll just, as they kind of roll in, I want to start with one. Can you speak to the sort of radicalization process within DoD? Do we see it mostly occurring prior to joining the forces or during, after? What's the typical pathway that we're observing?
We don't know. I mean, we just don't. I mean, I can tell you what a typical path. I mean, you can imagine what a typical pathway looks like for others. My guess is that pathway is the same, and whether or not someone's in the military or a veteran of the military, I think number one. So, okay, real quickly from this other violent extremism in America study that we did, I'd say one, we know that people who join these extremist groups have disproportionate mental health problems. And we know that they also have disproportionate perceptions of feeling stigmatized, alienated from society. So, so people sort of have that as their background, or many do. And then, they either meet friends or family members that expose them to extremist ideology, or they start tinkering with it on their own. They could start, you can start from a relatively safe space and be curious about what this content looks like. And you start exploring online and you get sucked into it. And that gets the ideology going. And then if you can connect that with, the social experience of somebody that's either in the group who brings you on board, or friends and family that you're radicalized with, or what often happens with these groups is they invite you to cookouts. I mean, cookouts is like the big thing is, Proud Boys, my guess is Proud Boys, neo-Nazi groups, all of those, they have a lot of cookouts. And these, like I had in my college when I was in a fraternity, we'd have cookouts to invite people to come and hang out with us because we wanted to build relationships with them. And if we can build relationships with them, then we can get them to join our group. It's the same thing.
Wow. So as sort of follow-up question to something you're talking about, where you mentioned Moonshot's work on these Google searches. Are, and pardon my ignorance, do we have an idea of what people are searching? Is it something as simple as like, how do I join Proud Boys or Proud Boys? Like, what does that search even look like?
It's a good question. I think
yeah,
they do have some data on that, and I won't try to pretend to remember what that data is. But yeah, I mean, just think about what you'd search. Like there are people that wanted to go to ISIS, and the question for them was, how do I get to ISIS? How do I travel to Syria? Or just searching for ISIS, right? If I wanted to look at a bunch of KKK propaganda, I might first Google might be KKK.
right.
And I'd probably have to scroll down a ways before I found a link that was going to be relevant for me. There's also publications, Daily Stormer, other things like that people can search for. So, it probably doesn't take too much imagination of how you would find that content. And then what Moonshot does is they just program those searches into their ad algorithm in the same way that Tide detergent, does the same thing. Like that when you Google Tide detergent, the first thing you see is an ad, because you probably see two things. First, you see an ad for Tide, and then you see an ad for one of its competitors, because the competitors also know that they need to put the word Tide in their ad algorithm mix.
So do we see Proud Boys putting up ads as well on Google?
I don't think Google will let them. I don't know. I'm not an expert in how those groups have engaged their propaganda online. And certainly more people know about Proud Boys now than what they knew probably before January 6th, or at least before the president mentioned them. President Trump mentioned them in one of his debates. My guess is they're probably not putting up ads. But there's a lot you could do. I mean, if I were like the Proud Boys social media guy, I would be heavily engaged in Facebook groups. I would join a lot of Facebook groups, and I would put, that would folks who might be interested in my type of content, and I would be, putting stuff in those groups, getting people interested, as well as like doing traditional things that people do, like cookouts and community events and offline events that, allow you to actually meet and interact with people.
Okay. So our next question is going to come from William. William, can you unmute yourself, and feel free to keep it unmuted while you ask your question.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. My question is, this presentation seemed to deal primarily with active military members, but I was just wondering what happens when military members leave, sometimes with no sense of direction. I feel like that's something that I hear a lot about, that veterans leave the military and they don't really know what's going to come next for them in life. How vulnerable is this group to this kind of, to this kind of extremism? And are there strategies that we can employ to help them fight that?
No, that's a great question. I think you hit a big point. Like, if you're in the military, you are in, generally, by many accounts, a hyper supportive environment. If you live on base, all your neighbors are in the military. All your social events are with people who are in the military. You live your life within the context of a unit where everyone's mutually supportive and you're doing stuff together, and it's and you're moving from base to base. So you don't have many installations. So you don't have many other friends. Leaving that hyper supportive environment as a veteran can be really challenging. So I think you really hit on a key point there, that people will leave the military, and some will certainly find themselves wondering, what are they doing? Who are they connecting with? Where are they? And then one can imagine at that point, then they get reached out by, someone in these groups who are targeting them. And that's probably how a lot of these people join. I think the key question is, what is the at-risk rate? And that we don't know. That I don't know. Like, what is the prevalence rate of veterans joining these groups, or at least? And by the way, you don't have to join a group. Like, there's this whole ideological spectrum that also applies to this. My guess is that the risk of violence will be greater if you're in a group, but you can become a racist without joining a group. But the group does provide like that social bond that I think can be quite alluring. But my point is, I don't think we know the prevalence rate. And I think without knowing the prevalence rate, it's hard to know like what all do you need to do to address this, and how do you target it. It probably doesn't make sense for the veteran, like the VA and other organizations should probably undertake efforts to help veterans make that transition, to help ensure that their social networks stay solid as they make the transition. And there's probably a lot of ways you could do that. By the time someone retires, probably a lot of guys in their unit have also retired. And is there a way to keep those bonds alive? So those would all be helpful. There might be other more significant things the VA could do to do this, but it'd be hard to justify spending a lot of resources on helping veterans on these issues unless without knowing the risk factors, without knowing the prevalence rates.
Okay, thank you.
All right, our next question is from Nadine. Nadine, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So my question was, how effective are risk factor approaches in terms of identifying and preventing people who might be at risk from joining the military in the first place?
So, right now what the military has been, so there's a couple of things the military does. One is they'll ask questions. Have you joined any of these groups? Certainly if you've joined a group before, then that would sort of put you in a high risk category, I would imagine. So they're trying to screen out people who have been in those groups. They probably, I'm sure they're going to start reviewing people's social media feeds and things like that to make sure that they're ruling out those who, outright racists and others who have sympathy toward these groups. Though, that's probably a hard line to draw for them, but they'll probably be looking at some of the online characteristics. Certainly at the security clearance phase, they will be looking at that more closely. In terms of other risk factors, I think the fundamental challenge is the base rate of extremism is thankfully low, right? So there's not, I think it's growing as evidenced by some of the survey data that's out there. The risk is growing based on survey data. The risk is probably also growing based on other data such as race-motivated attacks and things like that. Good things you can quantify and look at over time. And we're definitely seeing increases in anti-Semitic acts, increases in race-based violent attacks. So all that suggests the base rate of this stuff is going up. But we just don't know. Like, you certainly wouldn't want to rule out people from joining the army just because they had a history of depression, and people who join extremist groups also have a history of depression, because the odds of the individual joining the military having a history of depression and being an extremist is infinitesimal. So I think that's just the trick, is that the base rates come into play and limit the ability of using what little risk factors we know as screening tools.
Excellent. I think Nadine muted herself, but if you have a follow-up, feel free to just give me a quick hint in the chat.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Our next question comes from Sebastian, one of our students. Sebastian, go ahead.
What's up, Sebastian?
Hello. Thank you for the talk so far. My question was, I know there's such a thing as passive extremism and kind of the counterpoint to the violent extremism. Now, when it comes to passive, I know that there are some tendencies that can start to develop kind of a habit to want to go to violent extremism. How does the military actively counter the passive version of this extremism, if it does at all? Just because I know that it's a little bit more difficult to justify like any direct action, given that nothing is technically happening, right? So let's say they're going on like social media and posting specific kind of content, or maybe on something like a dating app, and they're saying like, oh, I'm this, I'm that. How does the military go about dealing with those kind of things that may lead towards those violent tendencies?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the policy is, and the DoD policy is that you can't join and be a practicing member of these hate groups, or of violent extremist groups, or these hate groups. And there needs to be, I think there also needs to be some sort of impact on your operational functioning, on your work functioning, to be brought up on, I don't know what the rule is, but to be brought up on charges, or to be dismissed, or whatever, to have it like formally be addressed. Those things sort of have to be in play. Just being a passive member, like me, just like passively hating African Americans, is not grounds unless it impacts my operational functioning. So if that is being seen on how I'm interacting with Black people in my unit, if I'm mistreating them, if I'm not giving them equal shakes, all that becomes violations of military policy and would become grounds for removal. So that's on the strict policy side. Now, are there things the DoD could do to help limit and prevent people from either having these passive views, or transitioning from passive to something that would be much more of a risk factor? Like, I think that's a challenge. I think this counter ideology stuff is just a challenge. Like, we did several impact evaluations, and it's hard. It's hard to get these programs to get people to change hardcore beliefs about whatever their ideological issue is that they're focusing on. And I certainly don't imagine like running wholesale like communication campaigns in the Department of Defense to get people to dissuade people from becoming more extreme. And other programs, like we also looked at the evidence for bias training. The police departments do a lot of bias training in the military to help its officers like appreciate perspectives of African Americans and other minorities. Because they don't want their officers to shoot the African American minorities or engage in other sort of biased behavior. Those programs, though, show very limited effectiveness. Corporate anti-bias training, police anti-bias training, there's very little evidence that it works. So I feel like it's hard to hang your hat on that. So my view, the focus needs to be on like real basic stuff, like communicate what the policies are. So even if I'm thinking about it, like I know that if I'm not like giving fair shakes to African Americans in my unit, I'm going to get in trouble, right? The behavior is what matters. So whatever is deep in my head, and you can argue that everyone's racist deep in their head, but whatever is deep in my head, as long as the military can keep people from acting on that, doing the things they need to do and moving forward, I think that would be key. So information campaigns, promoting policy, helping improve the ability to detect evidence of extremism in the units, right? So if I do have these tendencies, like I know I can't even come out at all because my commander will see it, my fellow soldiers will see it. I don't want them to see it. I want to stay in the Army. So I'm just going to like put that deep down. I don't know. That's not a satisfying answer. It'd be nice to say, well, you just do this and that helps the deep down stuff come out and go away. I don't know really easily how you make the deep down stuff go away.
I think that's a fair answer. I wasn't expecting a very concrete one just because I know the nature of the question is also very difficult. But I appreciate the time you took to try to answer. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Next up, we have Ravi. Ravi, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, Dr. Helmus. Thank you for the talk. I have one question about the January 6th event, like relating to our talk today. Like, can you speak to the January 6th violent protest and then like involvement of any security personnel from the Capitol or in related areas?
Wait, I'm sorry. What's the question again?
The violent protest in the Capitol on January 6th, and if there is any involvement from the security personnel or police or military in that aspect.
Not that I'm familiar with. I know that I don't know if any of y'all read the Washington Post expose on January 6th that came out this last week. Their first article, or maybe it was their mid one, on but a guy named Don L. Harvin was worked at a DHS fusion center and was seeing a lot of the indications going on about what was happening. Well, let me put it this way. No, I've not seen any evidence or heard of any evidence of collusion on the parts of the security services on this. I do know that in preparation for the inauguration, they pulled a number of guardsmen from duty because those guardsmen, some of them had like bumper stickers on their car advocating for white nationalist or anti-government extremist groups.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Helmus.
Next up, I think Kim is gonna try to ask a question. I'm not quite sure if she's able to unmute herself, but Kim, go ahead and unmute yourself if you're able to. Oh, no, I guess not. So I'll go ahead and...
You can ask the question in the chat. I can see it.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, there it is, Kim. My webcam is broken. Sorry. Have you had any metrics with people with neurodevelopment disorders in the military and being involved in extremism? No, I'm not seeing indications of that. Not that that could not be an issue, but there you're probably talking about two very like low base rate behaviors. Now, extremism is a low base rate behavior relatively, and probably these neurodevelopmental disorders that you might be referring to. I'm not sure which ones you're referring to, but those are probably also a little bit on the lower base rate. So there, you know, if there is an association there, it'd be hard to pick up.
I had a couple questions, so I'm going to ask two, and feel free to answer whichever ones you'd like. And this one has been posed, this one we've been posing as a class to each other, to the students, but also to all the speakers, which is, what do you think the role of social media companies is in sort of countering extremism and radicalization? And the other question is related. Have we seen, or do you have any awareness of whether or not this anti-vaccine movement is being used as a recruiting tool in any way, or a messaging tool?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I'll take the second first than the first question, because the second one's easier. I don't know of any evidence on that. But I think that'd be a really interesting area of study. And I'm not sure if someone is looking at it and I'm not familiar of it, or if not, somebody should be looking at that. But yeah, I mean, you certainly a lot of hallmarks of people that are engaged in the anti-vax movement, sympathy toward conspiracy theories in general, and obviously probably the way they process news and information, the suspicion they have toward government, and why is government collusion and coordinating all these things against me, right? I would, if I were recruiting for an extremist group, I'd like to know who those people are, because then they'd probably be the first one I'd talk to. Whether or not they would actually be at risk, I don't know. Yes, here I go. Yes, they are recruiting an anti-vax, anti-mask movement. Lots of overlap with anti-government and conspiracy theories. So whoever wrote that, yes, that seems right on target. And she's in Canada. And so, yes, that seems relevant. Doesn't surprise me. The first question is, I think, yeah, there is a lot of responsibility. There's probably responsibility in two different ways. One, don't make the problem worse unnecessarily. And I think we've all got this message in this last couple of weeks from Facebook that they, by all evidence, have undertaken a number of initiatives to make the problem worse in ways they did not have to and was not necessary. And the obvious point there is the algorithmic things that they do that determine what pops up on your Facebook screen on the top of the screen. And they found out that stuff that gets people angry, gets people mad, gets people riled up is the stuff that promotes sharing and makes the money. And they have promoted that then. So that's part of it. Another angle on that is going into operating in countries, and I find this is the biggest sin, is operating in countries where they are completely unable and unwilling, or unprepared to do the very basic task of policing their own policies. And so you get things like cartels murdering people online because even though Spanish is Spanish and a lot of people speak Spanish, apparently Facebook does not dedicate near the resources to Spanish as it does to English, and God help people that live in other countries. So there's that. And then the other part is efforts to deplatform. We know from ISIS efforts that Facebook, I thought Facebook, Twitter, huge success story in the counter ISIS fight, huge success story. They were able to deplatform ISIS relatively quick within a span of 2 years. Islamic State got kicked off the platforms. So that was a big success. They can obviously do those things now. You can only deplatform if you're violating terms of service. But I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that folks that should be deplatformed by virtue of the terms of service and the content they're putting out are not being deplatformed at probably the rates they should be.
All right, great. So we've hit the 1 o'clock hour. If there are any other questions, feel free to raise your hand or just give me a quick message. Let's see if anything rolls in. Alrighty. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming to our talk and thank Dr. Helmus for speaking today. I want to encourage everybody to swing by next Friday on November 12th. We're going to have Dr. Elizabeth Yates, who is a senior researcher at START at the University of Maryland. And she'll be talking about hate crimes in the 21st century. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Helmus. We appreciated your talk and definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.
Let's see.
Feel free to reach out if there are questions.
Oh, and I do want to, let's see if I have it. I do want to encourage everybody, let's see if I can find the link. Dr. Helmus did provide a link to a recent RAND report that I would encourage everybody to read.
Yeah, that's the report that my talk is based off of.
Yeah, so
you could read the words I just spoke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Helmus.
All right, take it easy.
All right, have a good one, everybody. Enjoy the weekend.
Bye. Good weekend, everyone.